Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. So often we start the show, whichever one of us is starting the show, by talking about who's in the host chair today. I guess it's fair to say that we are in the dual seat.
Yeah, we're in that driver's ed car where both sides have the brakes.
And yeah, brakes, not a steering wheel. Actually, it's interesting that Alexis brings that up because I spent some time while I was in college many decades ago working for a driving school, and so I'm very familiar with being in a car that has the brake on the passenger side. And I tell you, more than once when I had the brake, I wish that I also had
The steering wheel?
Yeah, that I had the wheel. But as we start here today, as you can tell, Alexis and I are both engaged in the podcast today, and actually, this is the first of several episodes that are going to come together with a common theme. Alexis, when did we first start talking about the theme of what the next? I guess we've decided 4 episodes are going to include. How long ago was that?
Pretty early on in the podcast process. You'll see as we go through the topics that we're gonna have the next few weeks that they're big, and they were kind of already ones that we were thinking about anyway. So that as we started thinking about it more, we're like, oh, there's a theme here. So yeah, pretty early on.
Yeah, it's and the theme is actually going to be about the impact of weather on history, and particularly we're going to talk about one particular weather phenomena that's going to be a recurrent theme through these shows. They're going to span, they're going to span well over 5 centuries plus worth of time.
Yep.
Before it's all said and done, and you'll see that there are some common themes that are weaved in throughout them. You'll see things that are obviously different about them. In fact, you might generally say they break into 2 broad categories. And 2 of the episodes or 2 of the shows were actually going to be the weather is sort of going to be the story.
Right.
And then in the other 2, the weather is going to be a major
Factor in the story.
Factor or influencer in the story. And the weather phenomenon that's going to be common all the way through these actually is what we call, at least in the northern hemisphere and in the Atlantic basin, a hurricane. I know that because what I do in my vocation is work for a company that provides professional weather support. I'm not going to insert an ad here, but you can reach out to me on the podcast page if you want to learn more about or have a need for that. But what we do as an organization is we provide commercial weather support to companies. And a big part of what we do, because of the part of the world that we're based in, is providing that type of support to companies when it comes to tropical weather. And so as we draw towards June, and we're now in June, the first episode will release in June. We're recording right before the 1st of June, is we're about to enter into, for the Atlantic Ocean and for the Atlantic Basin, meteorological term there, this is the start of hurricane season. It runs from the beginning of June each year, technically through the end of November each year.
You have to get technical.
Yeah, well, I say technical because as of the time of this recording, we've already had our first 2 named storms.
One of which happened before the season even started.
Yeah, actually, both of them have, which has become a common theme. And so when we talk about the Atlantic quote-unquote season, we're talking about a period of time when generally the likelihood is there. It doesn't mean that storms can't occur outside of that, either early or after. But we've now chased a whole lot more meteorology and a lot less alternate or counterfactual history here, so we won't go there. But that's one of the reasons why this topic is of interest to me. And so there's really a couple of things about this topic, and we'll get into the introduction here a little bit more, and then set up the first one of the things that we're actually going to cover on the episode on the show today. But first of all, it's the realization that weather is often an influencing factor on history. In particular, a major type of weather system like a hurricane can have tremendous impact or tremendous effect. And that effect can be in the near term, impacting the actual events that are going on. That's what 2 of our episodes will talk about. Or they can actually impact a much longer period of time in an area. And so I mentioned, because being in an area, part of the world where we experience hurricanes,
Pretty frequently.
Yeah, I've grown up with that all of my life. Certainly, I've been through. After you've been through your first one, my first one was back in 1983 as a teenager. I sort of wanted to go through that one. After that, don't need to do it again.
Good.
And I've had others. And of course, I mentioned that I deal with this on a regular basis as part of what my job is. And so that's part of the reason. Hurricanes were an interesting thing to us. That's part of the reason we connected to that. The other thing is that at least two of the geographies that we're going to talk about here today are close to us in terms of proximity.
Yep.
One of them is very close. The other is close enough that you'll understand the connection here as we're, as you know, based in Texas. And then the other part is they connect to types of history that we like.
Yep.
In Alexis's case, you can guess what that would be connected to. And then we have those British showing up again, this time interacting with the Americans. So we've talked around it enough now. So perhaps we should, I don't know, Lex, we didn't even talk about this off podcast. Should we leave our audience in suspense each week, or should we give them the broad sweep?
Oh, what we're gonna cover?
Yeah.
I think leave them in suspense. Now, we should point out that, these next few episodes will be themed, but you can listen to them as a standalone. We're not gonna really talk about things over the broad scope that you'll miss if you kind of miss an episode. So you can listen to them as standalones, but I think leave people in suspense.
Okay. Alexis has spoken. Let it be written, let it be done. So we will not give you the full scope of things here. We did decide that we're going to move through these 4 topics chronologically, oldest to newest. So the first of the things that we're going to talk about here is a major event in world history that has a weather flair to it. Mm-hmm. So what event are we going to be talking about, Alexis?
That would be the Spanish Armada.
The Spanish Armada. So it has Spanish in the title, but who's also involved in the story?
Of course, England.
Of course, England. So imagine that. Who would have thunk that Alexis would be participating in a podcast episode that has England included in it? But actually, she has ties to 2 of these 4 episodes in a very particular way. The first one here because of her love of English history, and the other one because she's decided you're in suspense. I would have gone a different way here, but she's decided you're going to be held in suspense. The other one is a little bit more of a personal connection, and we'll explain that when we get to it. But before we get into all of that and sort of set up the Armada, this is probably a good time for us to start talking for a minute and let you hear from some of the folks that help make the show possible. So we'll be back in just a bit.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. We sort of set the scope before we took that small break for what's going to happen on this episode and the subsequent 3 episodes. As we already talked about, today we're going to focus on a particular event in history, and that's the Spanish Armada. That's English history. Alexis is here, so why in the world should I keep talking? I'm going to let her set things up for us. You ready to do that, Lex?
Sure, why not? Yeah, I could probably do this in my sleep. So a little bit of background on the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada happened in 1588, so it is the first in our little series we're going to be going through. It's the furthest back in time. So background on that is England and Spain had been, of course, as we've talked about in previous episodes of the show, kind of centuries-long enemies. And of course, tied into that is also France and Scotland. So England had gotten involved in the recent years leading up to 1588 in this thing called privateering, which let's call it what it really was, piracy. In the New World, which Spain was obviously very dominant in the New World in North and South America. So England had kind of started to dip its toes into that realm of the world with exploration and things like that, as well as piracy. So things were already kind of hairy and kind of had some tensions going on between England and Spain leading up to 1588. 1587 is kind of a banner year. That is the year that Mary, Queen of Scots, who is the ruler of Scotland, England's neighbor to the north, is actually beheaded on the orders of Elizabeth I. So, again, you have this whole thing of enemy is my friend. Mary, Queen of Scots, is the Queen of Scotland. She has been beheaded by the Queen of England. Scotland and Spain were allied. So, Philip II kind of decides to attack England in kind of retaliation for the death of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587.
Okay, and this, of course, is all set with the background there again being the tensions that exist between Protestantism and the Catholic Church, and so the tie back to the Henry VIII split, and
right.
Again, it seems like every time, we constantly find ourselves back to this topic in history because it's a dominant thing in history for centuries during that period of time. So that's also the backdrop here, and so there are political rivalries, there are economic rivalries, there are religious rivalries, and that all lead up to this particular event, which is, I guess I've heard it sometimes referred to as the Grand Enterprise, or some of the other ways that I've heard it described, which is the effort by Spain to launch its invasion of England, which is an island nation, so you have to do that by
water,
by boat. And so they build a large fleet, the size of that fleet, about 130-ish ships?
150.
150 ships of varying size. And again, England was known already by this point for her abilities as a naval power. Spain, not
as much.
Yeah, although not inexperienced, obviously, being a nation that had a coastline both on the Mediterranean as well as a coastline on the borders on the Atlantic. And so that's where we find ourselves in 1588. By the way, I think I've mentioned this book before. One of the books that I had to read for a history course in college by an author by the name of Garrett Mattingly is entitled The Armada. And it's actually an excellent book. And in fact, the opening of that book, I think I've mentioned this before, is the very thing that you were talking about, which is sort of setting the scene for the way that Mary. Now, which Mary is this?
This is Mary, Queen of Scots. So yeah, a little bit of background real quickly on her. Mary, Queen of Scots is a granddaughter of Henry VII. He had a daughter who went up and married the King of Scotland, so she descends from that line. So she does have a claim to the English throne, and as you mentioned, she is Catholic. So there's a lot of in play in regards to Mary, Queen of Scots.
And how is she executed?
She's beheaded.
Okay. So what I remember about reading that history book, Mattingly's The Armada, was as he sets the first chapter, it's almost like you would see the opening of a movie. It's describing her being led to the place of execution and everything that happened there. And I'm trying to remember now, what is she wearing underneath?
She's basically dressed as a martyr. She's wearing red, which is the color of martyrdom. She's very much, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die in the most symbolic way possible.
Yeah, I remember that being described in the book, and then again, it played like a movie scene as it was being written. It was a very good hook to the book. The other thing that I actually remember about the book, interestingly enough, there was like an introduction or a footnote talking about the fact that how dates had to be dealt with. We did have our episode about calendars. And we talked about the need to reset from the Julian to the Gregorian. This is actually during that period of time when England and the continent are not in
sync
on the calendar. And so one of the things that the author has to do is point out he had to make a choice when he's talking about dates about which way he was going to go. I think that's really the first time I remember encountering that in reading something in history where the author had to point that out, which sort of drew my attention to it. And I think I may even mention that perhaps when we did the calendar episode. That's just one of the things. There's several things about that book that I remember. I remember the stuff about the actual Armada, the events we're going to eventually get to here. I know we're about 13 minutes in and we haven't gotten to them yet. And the historical, we haven't got to the historical what if yet, which is the important thing. But what I remember two things. I remember that opening sequence, that opening chapter sort of played like a movie, and I remember, oh yeah, I've got to explain to you when I use a date, this is what I mean, and how he was actually going to take care of that. So, having set that housekeeping in place, the historical result of the Armada, and again, we're going to talk a little bit about the historical what did before we go into the what if, but the historical what did was who won?
England.
England won, which in this case was defending themselves from territorial attack.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, as I remember the story, there's not even the Spanish forces which were going to land or be transported over from the continent after essentially the naval battle had been secured. That didn't even happen. There never was a landing by Spanish forces or Spanish allied forces, because they had forces that were in the Netherlands, or the Duke of Parma and all of that fun stuff. They never actually set foot on English soil.
Nope, never happened.
So this ends up being, in the sense that it's a battle, it ends up being completely and totally a naval battle and never a land battle, which is why I think we refer to it as the Armada. If they had actually set foot on English soil, we probably would refer to it as the Spanish. We still have called it the Spanish Armada, but we'd probably deal more with the fact that it was the Spanish invasion or the Spanish occupation, or even if England had been successful at repulsing a Spanish landing, which, by the way, I think they would have been effective at that. There's some question even about what the Spanish goal was.
Right, yeah.
Once they landed, it seems to be to have at least seized London and at least installed
a puppet ruler.
Yeah, and then seeing where things go from there. So we can talk a little bit about that, because that will be part of the historical what if. But in the historical what did, there never is really a ground battle that's part of this.
No.
There's the battles that have been going on between English forces and Spanish led and occupied forces in the Netherlands, but never here on the soil. So that's why we refer to it as the Armada. So England is victorious. One of the things that they ascribe that victory to, actually, let me take a little detour here. We talked about hurricanes being part of what goes on here. It's only a recent late invention that we actually give tropical weather systems names. We're going to discover that a little bit, because in the things that we're going to talk about here, I guess it's actually true that only one of the four that we're going to talk about actually has a name. They're normally referred to by something else. And sometimes that there is a name. It's not in the sense of that we give it either a male or a female name, which is common not only in the Atlantic Basin, but common globally. And I learned a little over 6 years ago that, yes, they're all tropical weather, but some are called hurricanes, some are called typhoons, some are called tropical cyclones. It all just depends on what part of the world you're in. But regardless of what you want to call this, a hurricane, a tropical system, a tropical cyclone, this is definitely not a typhoon. It does not have a name in the sense that we give it in a modern meteorological sense. However, there is a name assigned to this storm that happened. And what is the name that's assigned to that, Lex?
The Protestant wind.
The Protestant wind. And why do they call it the Protestant wind?
Well, because England is a Protestant nation, and it was a windy time that pushed the Spanish away.
Yeah. So, without getting in, again, we could spend, and there probably is a whole podcast out there, so maybe I'll look for one and maybe even include that in the show notes, who covers history and will cover this event in history. Ultimately, I mentioned that Spanish forces never land, and after they suffer defeats at sea or begin to lose the battle at sea, they're dealing with the elements that are brought in by this weather system, which is what we're going to talk about, the historical what if. And eventually they have to take the long route around. They actually basically totally encircle the British Isles, and then and go out to sea, and historians and meteorological historians will argue that this was probably the result of, if not what we would call today a hurricane, the type of system that produced a hurricane. So overall, the plan was for Spain to gain control of the English Channel and the coastal waters of England, particularly the area between the Netherlands and the island proper.
Yep.
So Spanish land forces were in the Spanish
Netherlands.
Netherlands. So talk a little bit about what that is.
So when we're talking about Spain, you need to remember that Spain is part of the Habsburg dynasty at this point. So not only do they have Spain, they have the Netherlands, they have vast territories in what is modern day Europe. So what's trying to happen is the forces that are coming from the Armada from Spain proper are trying to hook up with the forces that are in the Spanish Netherlands, which is all part of the same empire.
And so the ground forces are not on. The ground forces that would be the major part of the invasion are not on the Spanish ships that have sailed from. I think they left from the harbor of
Cadiz. Yes.
They're not coming from Spain. I mean, there obviously are forces there that would be part of that, but their job is to come and ferry and to link up with forces that are already much closer to England on the continent. They've actually already been fighting English troops on the continent. One of the things I remember about Matt Ingley's book, The Armada, I really thought it was going to be a book mostly about
the naval sparring.
The naval sparring, which it was, but he had to provide the background of who this guy, the Duke of Parma, was, who was a brilliant military tactician for Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and was able to use smaller forces, and again was well regarded as a land commander. So part of the goal was to get him and his forces over onto the islands so that they could do what they needed to do.
Right.
And so that was the major part of the plan. So that required what we think of today in modern military concepts as logistics.
Yes.
They had to get the ships to the right places, pick up men, ferry men. If I remember correctly, I think they were going to bring men across on barges and other means to bring them across, with the Spanish forces there. One of the things that's important about the Spanish ships is they are not quite up to the same level of, I guess, seaworthiness or effectiveness as the English ships, right, Lex?
Correct. There's England, of course, we've mentioned before. England, Great Britain is an island nation, so they're really good at this navy thing. Spain was good and was getting better at it, but in terms of superiority with ships, England was far greater in their superiority. In terms of speed of their ships, size of their ships, they weren't as bulky as the Spanish ships, so England definitely had the advantage.
Right, and of course the English ships were sailing out from their various ports. They weren't having already had to have accomplished a fairly lengthy sea voyage to arrive there, and their job is not to link up with forces or to coordinate logistically. Their job is to disrupt the coordination. So I know at various points, for example, the English use fire ships. They use other means to do this.
Right. Another thing about the Spanish Navy, the Spanish Armada, is they tend to attack in very strict formations. So another thing the English had advantage on is the things like fire ships. If they can see the Spanish coming in that very strict formation, it's very easy to send a fire ship in to kind of cause disarray, because the Spanish ships are having to adjust to try and not get hit by the fire ship.
Right. And as I mentioned before, the Duke of Parma, who would have commanded the land forces, military historians regard him very highly. You don't see the same type of things being applied to the Duke of Medina Sidonia in terms of his skill as a naval commander, as an admiral.
No.
I don't think there are any grand statues to him as a naval commander.
No.
So I'm actually looking at a quote here from Robert Hutchinson, who's a historian. When he talks about how the Armada was defeated, he basically sums it up very quickly. It was bad luck, bad tactics, and bad weather that defeated the Spanish Armada. But as we said, the purpose of our goal today is to talk about what would have happened had there not been the hurricane. So the hurricane's impact is that it makes it very difficult for Spanish forces to get to where they want to, when they want to, how they want to maintain that position. And because, again, what they needed to do was anchor and pick up or ferry the ground forces over for the invasion to be successful, they're not able to do that.
Right.
So instead of this turning into a Spanish invasion of the English mainland in terms of how it actually played out, you might argue, again, as Hutchinson did, it was bad luck and bad tactics, but it was exacerbated by
bad weather.
They're not able to execute even if the tactics were bad and their luck was bad, they're not able even to execute the bad tactics because the weather interferes with that.
Right.
And so what it ends up being is only a naval engagement, which is going to favor
Pretty heavily for England.
right, and as the defender in a naval engagement was going to aid them. And in fact, at the end of the day, one of the interesting things here is less than half of the Spanish fleet actually several months later,
Yeah.
after the events, which are
They're in July, August.
yeah, and they make it back to Spain, or what makes it back to Spain makes it back
October.
right. And the reason it takes so long is because of the weather, they find themselves where they actually don't come immediately back from the southern coast of the English Isles, but they actually have to sail all the way.
They actually have to go up towards Scotland and go out into the Atlantic to get back to Spain. They have to go a very circulatory route.
Right. And that's a result of the prevailing winds, which in some ways are the seasonal winds, but are also the winds that blew them in this direction. Because, again, believing this is a hurricane that moved across the Atlantic and was moving, or at least the remnants of a hurricane. Typically, by the time they're that far off, they're just the remnants of something. That still happens today. In fact, last year, there was a storm that actually sort of reminded me of this in the sense that the remnants of it, arrived into Europe, where some of my European colleagues are. So the remnants of this would have come from the southwest. So the system is moving from the southwest to the northeast. So it's pushing them in the direction of up the English Channel and the long way around, and making it difficult for them to maintain their position where they wanted to in the channel for the link up and ferrying operations. But then also, once they were defeated, they couldn't easily take the most direct route back to Spain, but actually had to go the long way around and had to endure the weather conditions there.
Correct.
So the weather impact is sort of twofold. The weather impact is that it disrupts the actual operations, and even once they've been defeated, it makes the defeat even more
grand.
Yeah, it exacerbates the defeat. So again, there's a lot of history there. We covered a lot of what did, something in the order of about 25 minutes of what did if we include the intro. But we're what type of podcast?
A what if.
Well, what if podcast. So let's talk about the what ifs. What are some of the what ifs that pop into your head, Lex?
So one of the kind of immediate what ifs that pops into my head is we've talked about bad tactics, but if it's clear weather, bad tactics can work. So it's what if they were able to ferry those troops and then actually land on the coast of England. And I think, we kind of talked about, I think that, the English Navy was good, but the English Army is also very good too. So I think you would have seen some pretty fierce and pretty ferocious land battles happen if that was to be the case.
Yeah. And, one of the things I remember thinking about, I guess it was back when I read it again, as you can tell, I remember a lot about Matt Ingley's book, even though it's been 30 plus years since I've read it.
A few decades?
Yeah, it's been a while back. I'm looking at it over here on the shelf. I keep doing that. And you can tell it looks like an older book. But what I remember there, again, you could tell as an author, and you could tell as he talked from the military historian point of view, the Duke of Parma was very highly regarded as a land force commander. And so while I do believe it's very unlikely in the historical what if that Spain would have been successful in a land invasion, or certainly not an occupation of the entire English Isles. That's absurd. It would have had to be something strategic that would have accomplished some task for a period of time and then suing for peace. Or I think the other hope had been at that point then Spanish allies would come to their aid. And so probably what ultimately would have happened might have been the abdication of Elizabeth at point of force from the throne, the installation of a Catholic monarch. And I know one of the things that Spain was hopeful for was not that they would be fighting the entire English populace, but there were definitely those that were in England that were willing to support the Catholic cause.
Definitely.
And so I think the idea here was not that Spain has to be successful in invading and conquering England. They just have to be successful in getting there and getting some things rolling, and then maybe things would happen, right?
Yeah, a total conquest, I think, is completely not plausible at all, but I think it's not out of the scope of possibility that they would have taken London. And so you would have had Elizabeth possibly being held hostage, possibly being forced to abdicate, possibly even killed. And if you have the Spanish occupying London, it gives the Catholic supporters in England time to rally their troops and time to come to the aid of Spain.
And would there have been what was the nature of Scotland compared in terms of the percentage of, I guess, those in Scotland who were sympathetic to Catholic causes versus Protestant causes?
So Scotland is interesting at this point because when Mary, Queen of Scots, comes back from France to actually take control of her country, Scotland has become Protestant. She's kind of seen as this outside force and kind of alien, for lack of a better word, force, because she is not with the predominant religion at the time. She is still Catholic, and she is leading a very Protestant nation. And because of what happens in the real timeline, she dies in 1587, which I'm assuming would have still happened if we're having the Armada be successful in 1588. She had to abdicate actually 20 years previously, she had abdicated in favor of her son, James, who was being raised Protestant. So I think there were definitely pockets of Catholics still in Scotland, but I don't think you would have seen Scotland coming to the defense of Spain in quite the same way that you would have had 20 years previously when Mary Queen of Scots was still on the throne, because they've transitioned. They're now a Protestant country that is really trying to super peace with England.
Okay. So, again, I bring that up, for my own edification and better understanding there, to make sure I understood what I thought I already understood. So, to the extent that there is an uprising inside of England as a result of the Spanish landing, it really is sort of a civil war that's broad and widely played out. It would not have been areas of loyal Catholics opposing areas of those that were Protestant favoring. There was an intermingling of those forces, and so it would have been, however the battle lines would have played out in terms of the actual ground battle, to the extent that the Englishman was fighting Englishmen, it would not have been from a region necessarily per se, but would have been tied back to their religious beliefs and understanding.
Right.
Okay. And I think it is reasonable to believe, would you agree with me here in terms of the historical what if, that if Spain had successfully landed, there would have been other Catholic nations that would have undertaken some action in support of that.
Right. The one that immediately pops to mind is France. France is still very much Catholic at this point. And of course, we have that, again, I'm going to keep saying it, the age-old thing of that kind of triple alliance, so to speak, between France, Spain, and Scotland. So Scotland is kind of out of that picture right now, but France is still very much a Catholic nation. So I think if Spain had been successful, you would have had France coming to the aid for sure.
Okay. So let's carry the what if here along. Maybe these are individually not high probability sets of successes, but let's look at maybe the what if of what would have been the maximum thing that a Spanish success might have looked like. So there's no bad weather, which we said is a major factor in making this work. So as you pointed out, as the one historian has said here, it may have been bad tactics and bad luck, but some of that bad luck may have been the result of the bad weather, the bad tactics for the bad tactics. So the weather doesn't happen, so they're able to do the link up, they're able to land forces, they're able to have whatever level of success that they have. So I'm going to argue the most successful thing that would have happened would have been the capture and or killing of the monarch. If Elizabeth falls into Spanish hands, either because she's captured by Spanish forces or she's handed over by Catholic supporting English forces, where you actually have the monarch either being held hostage, imprisoned, or as a result of that, being killed. Who is the logical claimant if she either abdicates voluntarily or abdicates as the result of she's no longer living?
Well, I think ultimately it would be a puppet situation. I think Philip definitely wanted the power. He would just not put himself on that throne. He would put somebody else on that throne for him. And I think probably the most likely would be another descendant of Henry VII through another granddaughter, actually by the name of Arabella Stuart.
Okay.
Again, she's Catholic. She's a granddaughter of Henry VII. She is the descendant of, I want to say Mary, his daughter Mary. I could be wrong. there's a lot of Mary and Margarets and Elizabeths in this period of history, so it's really easy to confuse them. But I think Arabella Stuart would have been the leader simply because you have a lot of descendants of Henry VII, but they're all Protestant. She was a Catholic, so.
Okay, so let's make her the at least in our primary historical what if, who obtains the throne of England. Is she already married at this point?
She's not.
Okay, so one of the ways that you would secure that in this historical what if is probably very quickly putting her on the throne and then marrying her to someone who would be able to support that position and thus would have a claim if action were taken to try to remove her, they were trying to restore her. So who would be possible candidates for her to be married to in this historical
Well,
what if?
Philip has some sons. He has a son, Don Carlos. So I think that's totally a possibility. And of course, even if we have young sons that are a possibility, that happened all the time. So it was like, you're going to get married to my 6-year-old. I'm not sure exactly how old Don Carlos was at this point, but you're going to get married to my 6-year-old. But the promise that later on we'll have a son. So I think that's the most likely scenario. It's also possible, I think, although a little bit less likely, that Philip possibly even married her off to one of his generals. Maybe somebody like the Duke of Parma, like the Duke of Medina Sidonia, just to kind of further that militaristic aspect of the invasion and of the capture of England.
So in this historical what if, Alexis, would you say that, okay, you say puppet regime, we'll use that term, to use the modern term for that, or an installed regime that's put in place there. This is now second generation Protestant England, though. So aside from the fact that the monarch in the case of Henry VIII had swapped allegiances in terms of the religious wars and the religious dissension that's going on in Europe, there were legitimate Protestants in England by this time. So they probably are not going to sit idly by.
No, they're not going to take too kindly to this.
Yeah, so if you have an installed monarch, call it a puppet regime, or call it whatever you want to call it, what is the likelihood in this historical what if? Again, that would sort of be the ultimate Catholic success, Spanish success, is they remove Elizabeth through her own choice, or they remove her through force, the ultimate version of force being execution. She had no heirs, so that also ends any future concerns there.
Right.
What is the likelihood that an installed Catholic, Spanish-backed, maybe even married to Spain monarch is able to retain the English throne?
I don't think very likely. The thing that keeps popping into my head is something that occurred in the real timeline when Henry VIII did his switch from Catholic to Protestant, was a thing called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was a lot of very upset nobles that were not happy with this decision, and they essentially marched on London. Now, they were disbanded. It didn't succeed. But I think if you have this puppet monarch that is Catholic, and you have a lot of pockets of very powerful, now committed Protestants, I think you would have seen something like that. And I think it would have been successful because you would have had... There was a little bit more of an established Protestant tradition at this point. I think when, the Pilgrimage of Grace happens very quickly after Henry VIII makes that transition. I think now that you've kind of lived with it for a few generations, as you were saying, it's kind of become entrenched, and I think people are a little bit more willing to fight for something that they don't necessarily agree with, in that case being a Catholic ruler.
Okay. So is it a fair thing to say under this, again, we're looking at sort of the ultimate Spanish success here. Mm-hmm. And again, tying back to our original historical what if here is that the weather didn't have the impact that it did, and everything else broke in their favor. So what you just described there, is this a long-term Catholic England?
I don't think so. I think ultimately England would throw off the puppet ruler that was put in place. And I think because Spain had such a vast empire, it kind of would become almost an American Revolution scenario in that Spain would kind of be like, I'm not going to deal with this. This isn't worth the upkeep that it was taking to keep that Catholic ruler on the throne of England. I think they would just kind of wash their hands of it, because they would be getting so many rebellions and so many things going up against them. They would just finally decide that this isn't worth it.
Okay. So the other extreme there would be the possibility or the what if of, yes, a Catholic queen, in this case, is installed, survives long enough on the throne to produce a male
heir,
who, let's say, is a combination now of English and Spanish blood, long enough for that to assume the throne. And let's assume that there is some level of, there's not going to be absolute tolerance. That was not going to be the case. But some level of a non-persecution of Protestant believers in England. If you set up sort of that, again, best case scenario for maintaining a Catholic-leaning ruler, she survives long enough. There's an heir. There's not so much oppression of Protestant thought that that constantly becomes the source of tension. There could have been some other political tension or religious tension. There was plenty of it going around during that period of time. Can you even imagine a scenario there where it may have just played out as a more benign version of what's happening?
That's an interesting. It's really hard for me to take out the almost Inquisition element from Spain. I think because it's so kind of entrenched in Spanish psyche, so to speak. So it's an interesting. I don't know, my brain is kind of struggling with removing kind of persecution from Spanish rule. But I think if you have a scenario where it's a Catholic ruler, but they're not really persecuting, and it's like, you're allowed to have your beliefs, I'm allowed to have mine, let's kind of live and let live, I think that could be a scenario where it does succeed and it does prosper, and you have a completely different bloodline on the throne of England.
Okay. And of course, the other what if I want to explore here at least somewhat is the timing. We're in 1588. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about the events around the English Isles. We're talking about the tension that exists between Spain and Catholic-aligned forces, England and Protestant-aligned forces. In much the way that Spain had become the defender of the Catholic faith, England was looked to as being one of the leaders of the Protestant movement from a political standpoint. That's all what's happening in Europe.
Yes.
There's this whole other thing that's happened within the last 100 years. We're now almost 100 years removed from Columbus's voyages in 1492 to now 1588. Mm-hmm. There's what's going on in the New World. So one of the things that pops to my mind is, yes, there certainly might have been a situation in a matter of years, a matter of a decade or a couple of decades, where England threw off its puppet Spanish-installed Catholic overlords. Scenario. But this is a very critical time because they are not defeated by the Spanish. There continues to be English expansion into the New World, into North America, parallel to what's going on with Spain. And in fact, what eventually you mentioned earlier, what eventually becomes the colonies in the United States, most of them find their founding and their growth during the period of time immediately adjacent to the Armada here. So, one of the what-ifs for me that I imagine is, imagine the scenario where, let's say it's only short-lived, a decade, 15 years at most, but during that period of time, the real timeline expansion that we're accustomed to by England into the New World is stymied because they're under Spanish control. Spain is able to gather more of a foothold in the New World, maybe seizing English possessions or territories or settlements or colonies or other actions that have happened in the New World. Would you agree that there's this scenario where, yes, it's a very short term in Europe, it's a departure, and that would have ripples that go down through history, but that the bigger ripples of this historical what if probably are not in the Eastern Hemisphere, but actually exist in the Western Hemisphere?
Oh, I can totally agree with that. I'm just kind of I'm picturing that colonial map that we kind of saw if you ever took American history in elementary and middle school. So it's if you remember, Spain was kind of focused on South and Central America, kind of where we're sitting now in Texas, and down to the south, whereas England was focused on the eastern seaboard. France as well was kind of up there. So I think if you have this scenario where England is under this Spanish puppet proto ruler, they might be focusing on what we thought of as the original 13 colonies of England and the eastern seaboard a little bit more, and it would have changed how the colonies were formed and developed for sure.
So what we think of as eventually being the English colonies that become the colonies that become the United States might be more heavily influenced by Spain. Or again, if England is just diminished as a power so that Spain doesn't fill that vacuum immediately there, another France or some other power does fill in along what we think of today as being the eastern coast of the modern United States. And so that becomes less English in its influence. It maybe becomes Spanish, French. There already was a Dutch influence there. So that might have changed. And again, if you change the dynamic there, I think the more logical ripple of the deflection in history, yes, there would have been a change to European history that may have reset itself, and that could have had some impacts. England may be a little more Catholic today than it is now, but I think the real chance for departure, given the timing of this, is the departure that happens in the New World. And so, for example, where you and I are sitting here in Texas, which was a Spanish territory, ultimately becomes a Mexican territory, eventually becomes part of the United States and the expansion of Anglo-American influence. Well, if there's no Anglo-American influence, you and I being born in the same place where we are today might be speaking, this podcast might be in Spanish. Because there wouldn't have been, and we've had so many of our episodes focus on this because of our love for Texas history and American history, about the influence of the manifest destiny concept, what eventually caused America to grow and to take over this territory that was Texas. But before that was Tejas, and it was a Spanish territory. And so for me, the more interesting historical what if is, I tend to think of the European continental what if as being a little detour. I think of the North American, Western Hemisphere, Central American detour maybe being a little bit more of a detour. It may have been a permanent shift in the road that would have been a powerful thing.
I think that's definitely true, and it's interesting because I wasn't really focusing on that. I was focusing on Europe, but once you said that, I was like, oh wow, yeah, those 13 colonies might not have been 13 English colonies. For sure.
and so the traditions that lead to, we've talked about this before, that lead to the rise of the American Revolution and the concept of English law being expressed in a different way through American democracy doesn't have the same roots, and so it plays out a different way. Having said that, I think there's another possible way this goes. So imagine now a scenario, which I'm now going to contradict myself. That's the wonderful things of what if and counterfactuals.
You can do that.
I can do that. Is that now imagine the scenario where that installed Spanish influence, the puppet state, is more enduring. England becomes more Catholic. Maybe there is persecution of Protestants. A lot of what the settlement that happened in what we think of as being the English part of the New World were what? They were religious dissenters, refugees that were coming for various reasons. Now imagine that you have more Protestants that are being displaced in England. And so the way that this plays out, I could see this being a self-reinforcing concept where the installed, what's her name again?
Arabella.
Queen Arabella basically issues an edict that says, we're not going to persecute you. We just want you to
convert or get out.
Convert or leave. And if you want to leave, we're okay with you going to these territories over in the New World. Maybe there's taxation that's ultimately paid back to the English crown indirectly, tribute maybe paid back to the Spanish crown or whatever the case might be. But you can imagine the scenario where there is a larger more mainstream version of Protestants, because the ones that came, the dissenters that came,
Were the splinter groups.
were the splinter groups primarily, and in some cases they were the Catholics. Maryland, for example, are founded by Catholics that are leaving and are looking for religious freedom. But you have many of these that are found by splinter, smaller Protestant groups. So now imagine that what comes over are not Quakers and others that come, but are more mainstream, what we think of today, I guess, as being Anglican.
Yeah, Church of England. Lutheran.
Right. But yeah, exactly. Protestants. And so the other way this could have played out, we've talked about the scenario where what we think of as America today would be less English. I could also imagine, again, this exact same set of events producing an earlier, more influenced Anglican English influence, if that makes any sense.
No, I think that totally makes sense. I think that you're definitely right. In the real-time line of history, the people that were coming over for religious freedom were those dissenter groups, people like the Quakers and things like that. But I think if you have the persecution going on in England and Protestants fleeing, you would see a very pervasive influence of Church of England in the New World.
Yeah, and so for me it comes down to the ultimate question of what would have happened during this occupation period, occupied England, if you will, is whether it would have resulted in fight or flight. And I think it could be both. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive of each other, but I can imagine a scenario where, in addition to the fight aspect, which is the first place I wanted to go mentally too, they're going to fight. They've been invaded, they're being occupied. I don't think it can last, so I think that ultimately would have happened. But the scenario could also be just as quickly, because of the time frame, there's this outlet of where to go, either a sponsored leave.
Yeah.
We won't persecute you if you
go.
Or it could have been not sponsored by the installed monarch, but just that would have been what would have happened. And then you might have had the scenario where there's a lot more flight that eventually comes back to those that have taken the flight coming back and supporting the fight.
Right.
And so you may have had this strange scenario, if it goes on for multiple decades, where it's almost like a reverse colonization thing, where this newly formed English influence. New England is the term that we use to describe a portion of what is even the United States today.
Yeah. Still today we call it New England.
New England. Imagine that you have a New England where New England means now something different or more enhanced than it did before. It's the displaced England. That's the New England. It's not just owing its allegiance back to the Old England. It's where what was the Old England has now come to.
And I think it's interesting, if you are going on that aspect, I think it would have been almost more united. The thing about the colonies was they were all coming over, and you mentioned Maryland was Catholic. You had Pennsylvania, who was Quaker. You had all these different groups. If you have this en masse coming over, it's almost like those boundaries don't exist between the colonies, because they're kind of this one religion that is all bound together. So I think if you suddenly have that conglomerate of people launching back an offensive on England, I think there's a chance it would have been really successful.
Right. And then I guess the other thing that goes with that, not to chase this too far, but it's the other thing that popped into my head, you may have also seen that become a sanctuary territory, even more so for other Protestant mindsets that were coming over from Europe and fleeing from Europe. Because now you're dealing with a Europe that doesn't have England as a backstop, sort of continental Europe, supporting Protestantism. The Protestantism, for example, that's going on in Germany may have expressed itself in a different way without English support. Eventually there does become we talked about this before, House of Hanover, the other connections that actually happen between Germany and England. Eventually everybody's somehow related to Queen Victoria, right? We've talked about that before.
And they're all German.
Yeah, exactly. But you may have seen more of an earlier German influence. You mentioned Lutheran. More of an earlier German influence that may have found its way to the New World. And so this territory that we think of today being the United States may have been this interesting amalgam of English refugees. That's the term I'm going to use. That may be too strong a term, but essentially those who have fled England either because they've been told to go or they've chosen to go more so, and combined with other German and other continental Protestants who have come. And so what we'll still call it America, what eventually becomes America is much more grounded in a Protestant base.
Yes.
And a Protestant root. So much so that by the time, again, this diversity that exists in the colonies we've already talked about, again, assuming that they do throw off England or Spain or whoever actually controls the territory, or they become independent earlier, they're less inclined to be perhaps religiously tolerant because they are more religiously unified.
Yeah, homogenous.
Homogenous, exactly. And so even though they are Germans and English, just in my one example here, they are united in the fact that they are Protestant anti-Catholic. And so that becomes an identity for the new German English America that happens earlier or later, however it happens in a different way. But for example, you don't see as much of the religious diversity and the very early tenets that are going on in the American Constitution and the formulation of the American political system that are around this idea of religious liberty. Why? Because in many cases, each of the colonies was formed from a different strand of Protestantism, for the most part, but still a different strand of Protestantism.
Yeah.
So all of this happens. Why? Because the wind decides to blow. There was a low pressure system that crossed the Atlantic in the summer of 1588, found its unique timing with the long play. And the important thing to remember, the Spanish Armada was not like an all of a sudden overnight kind of decision. This was planned for
years.
For years and years. The ships had to be built. The forces had to be gathered. This was, in some ways, this was a known coming thing for England as well. But the timing, again, is such. We mentioned bad luck, bad planning,
bad weather.
The bad timing is that it happens to happen where it has this extra influence of a weather event, a hurricane, the Hurricane Protestant wind, I guess is what we have to call it, where that happens in such a way that it influences. And so, as we've sort of talked about here, and we've now explored both sets of what-ifs, it potentially changes, maybe only for the short term, the history of England and the history of the European continent, but it has the potential because of timing to have a much bigger influence on
the world. It's much more global.
Much more global, particularly the New World. So to me, I find that to be the more interesting what-if ripple that happens from that, because even as we've said before, and I won't belabor it, even a short period of time where England's under different control could have set in motion a whole set of forces that would have been the dominoes that crossed the Atlantic and fell where they did in the New World. Any more thoughts?
This was a good one.
Yeah.
I like that we went so far reaching, but again, that's one of the reasons why we love doing this. Is there's so many things that just you snipped out one thread and things could go in a dramatically different way. So
right. So we hope you've enjoyed the episode today, and as we talked about, this is really the first in a series of four thematic episodes. Again, where we're going to be particularly talking about a particular weather influence on history, and the weather is going to center around hurricanes. And we're doing that here in the month of June because it's the first month officially of the Atlantic hurricane season. So today we went back to 1588 and the Spanish Armada. We said we're not going to tell them what it is. Do we even tease them, Lex, with where the next place we land in history is?
We're jumping a few centuries ahead.
Okay.
And we're jumping to a different part of the world.
Okay. So, we talked about both sides of the Atlantic, but we primarily talked about the Europe side of the Atlantic. So, as we hop back in the magical time machine and we set the dials, we're going at least a couple of 100 years forward, and we're not going to be in England.
Well, England's going to play a part, though.
All right. So perhaps you figured out, and I'll sort of leave this as something that our listeners can be thinking about in the week to come before the release of the next episode. So put on your history scanning, thinking, knowledge caps, because I know we have a knowledgeable history audience. They wouldn't be listening to us if they weren't a knowledgeable history audience. That's my belief. So put on your history hurricane scanner And imagine
Find the storm.
Yeah, find the storm. Exactly. Find the storm moving forward, knowing that it's after 1588 and it's before today's present day. So at least we bounded.
Yeah. You have 500 years to search through.
Yeah, so we've bounded it there. So once again, we thank you for joining us here today. As always, we appreciate the time that you've given us. What are some of the ways that people can interact with us here at the podcast?
You can go to our website, which is aforkintimepodcast.com. The A is important. The podcast is important on the end of it. But you can go and check out everything there. You can find a backlog of all of our episodes. I think going back to like episode 7 is when around the time we built the website.
Yeah, all of the episodes are there. If you go to the listen link, you'll find them there. If you are accustomed to accessing us through the, it's really a blog page, but from the news page, I think where we first started posting an individual news item for an episode is episode 7, give or take. But all the episodes are there. If you go to the listen area, they're connected. They're back to Buzzsprout, which of course is where we host A Fork in Time. So,
yeah, and another thing you can do from there is we're still doing our COVID check-in. We're still living in some interesting times. I am back at work. I've been back at work for 2 weeks now, but even being back at work has some interesting ripples that I'm having to work through. So definitely we still want to hear from you. As we're working through this, and as we know that we're in Texas, so we know what is really going on in Texas, but we know we have listeners all over the country and all over the world as well, so you might be dealing with completely different set of circumstances than we are sitting here in Houston. So we want to hear from you with what you're going through. We want to hear from you to make sure that you're healthy and you're safe and everything's good. So you can also check in with us from that website as well. Just see the button that says COVID check-in.
Right. And I think, if not, I'll make sure that I'll include them. We'll include another just quick link to that in the show notes so you can get directly connected to there. I'll mention this. We talk a lot about the website. I know for me as a listener, I don't always check out the show notes of the individual podcasts that I listen to because they show up automatically in my podcast reader and I automatically listen to them. And so normally there's not a good reason to go and read the show notes unless I'm just intrigued by something. We do try to put in at least at a minimum. It's a cheap and easy way to do it. At a minimum, I'll put in at least the Wikipedia article normally for a topic that we're talking about. I'll do the same here. But we do include a number of links actually in the show notes so that it's easier to actually get to some of the things that we talk about. So just know that. You don't necessarily... I realize for most people, we've talked about this before, podcasting, listening is an audio medium. You probably aren't sitting in front of a computer when you do that. I know because we get statistics on the devices. It's one of the things that Buzzsprout does for us is tell us what devices. I know in almost every instance it's a phone or a mobile device of some type, maybe an iPad or something, or a pad or a tablet of some type. Be politically correct.
Be generic.
Generic there. However, our website is simple. It's not designed to be complicated. It doesn't have a lot of fancy animation on it. It loads pretty nicely on a mobile browser. And so if you connect to or click one of the links inside of the show notes and open up your mobile browser, you'll be able to interact with the site. For example, the COVID check-in that Alexis was just talking about, that will pull up. Mm-hmm. You'll be able to fill out the form there, do what you need to. So you don't need to... I know for me, what are my odds of remembering, oh yeah, A Fork in Time told me to go to my computer and fire it up. And I understand that's probably not going to happen. By the way, if it does, thank you.
Great.
We appreciate it. But you can access the site. It's mobile enabled, and a lot of the things that you can do there are also mobile enabled. What are some of the other ways that folks can interact with us there on the website?
Social media. You'll find links to all of our social media. We are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we're also on Pinterest. So Facebook, I know either myself or Dad or Don, we always share a link to the episode every Thursday when it posts, so you can go share that. It's real easy, and that's a good way to get the word out about the podcast to other people. I'll go share a link, and then I'll see people in my feed that are like, oh, let me go listen to this. So that's a good way to see it. So you'll see those links on the website as well.
Yeah, one of the things I've enjoyed, we're getting a little bit more interaction. We have a Facebook page.
Yes.
And so you can go to the Facebook page. We get some comments back there.
That we do check, by the way. We will respond to you.
Yeah. And so it's good. And I recognize people that have posted more than once, or for example, most of you know Brant and some of the others that have found our podcast and have joined us occasionally as co-hosts. They'll occasionally post something there, which is always a nice thing. But check that out. It's easy to get to from the website, but it's also another place to interact with us. We don't have an Instagram.
We might get one.
Yeah, we probably should. One of the interesting things I'd like to see on an Instagram, what I have enjoyed when occasionally I do have it for the people that connect with us on Facebook, is I get to put a face with a name. And so one of the cool things that can happen with Instagram, maybe we'll post at some point an Instagram challenge of asking our listeners to just post to our Instagram account, a picture, some type of picture about either them or something that's relevant to them if they didn't want to post a picture of them. One of my favorite podcasts, it's not one of Alexis's favorite podcasts, but they extensively use their Instagram page for showing, it's a fake internet courtroom. I'm not going to buzz. Yeah, I will. It's the John Hodgman podcast, Judge John Hodgman. But for example, any pictures that are used in evidence during their cases, they post to their Instagram page. And so one interesting thing that happens is I end up on their Instagram page, not because I'm a big Instagram user, but I want to see that picture that they're talking about. And I'd like to do some of the same type of thing with us. So social media, we do have feedback forms there, topic suggestions, all the things that go with that. A number of our topics have come from suggestions that come in. We welcome those. And when we say we welcome feedback, we welcome feedback.
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple of listener surveys actually completed this week.
Yay!
Yeah. We could use more of those. I learn something every time that one gets completed. We have a simple Survey Monkey survey that takes, probably 5 minutes at the absolute most. That's if you're really giving deep thought about the answers. But we've seen themes that have developed there in terms of understanding what's going on. We've been trying to tweak the podcast. This episode is running long. We've been working really hard at doing shorter episodes, whatever relevant, because people have
said... To be fair, this one ran long because we were introing that we're on a theme here.
That's true. But we also understand that most people can... My experience has been from people, the feedback there is that people say, if it's 3 hours, I'll listen to it, but so I don't care. Others are like, no, I really want it to be more that... I know a lot of us aren't commuting the same way that we used to right now, but more the typical commute. Like that's why you see podcasts go 45 to 60 minutes. I say that to say, if you take the time to give us the feedback, it is A, appreciated, and B, incorporated. We don't just ask for it for the sake of, having you say, oh, I love it, it's great. If it's constructive, if it's critical, as long as it's constructive, we want to hear it because we do get better by hearing the things. There's that Lake Wobegon effect. We all think we're above average. We all think we're better at some things than we are and that we're not. And for example, we know a constant theme there is multi-host shows are preferred. We knew that. It reinforces the fact that
it's nice to hear it.
When there's more than one of us, which is why Alexis and I are taking this opportunity to knock out several shows when we have the chance to do that. So the last thing we'll just mention, we hit this every week because every good podcast is supposed to, right? That's our Patreon link. As we've said before, we did not start a podcast to make money. I'm telling you now, unless you're going to be huge, unless you're not going to be in a niche like we're in a niche, you're not going to retire on your podcast. There's very successful podcasts out there that do fine commercially. That ain't us. That's not the reason that we did it. But it does help us to defray the cost. So if you enjoy the show and you can support or pledge even a one-time amount or recurring amount, we need to get better about some of the extra content and generating that on a regular basis that we promise our Patreon supporters, so we will improve that. But we appreciate that. Even a small amount helps. It helps to defray the cost. I'm sitting here realizing as Alexis and I are not recording remotely, but recording in the same room, we have a nice microphone setup that we didn't have a year ago when we started with this. Hopefully you're noticing that with the microphone and the mixer and the way that we bring things in. Hopefully you've seen an improvement in the sound quality. That was the result of Patreon support and what's there. So if you can, again, you'll find that link in the show notes. You'll find it there on the page. But as always, to the point of ad nauseum, we want to say thank you. The thing that we appreciate most is the fact that you come back every week. We know we have a consistent, loyal core of listeners who come back, and we do this for you. There have been weeks, particularly during COVID, when other things were going on. I'll be honest with you, it was not easy to make sure that we got a podcast episode out on time. You may have noticed that in the quality of what got out. So if an apology is due for that, we will give you an apology for that. But we it's a point of pride that we do release an episode every week, and we have every week. Even if it's one of Alexis's 7-minute episodes, we won't go into that. But we do that, and the reason we do that is we know that there are listeners out there who depend on showing up every week, and they mention in the comments or in the surveys They like the fact that it does show up every week, because there are podcasts that
Aren't consistent.
That aren't consistent with that. And when we said we were going to do this, we made a commitment to do that. So the fact that I know I have Patreon supporters who have paid a little bit for that, and others who I know are depending on it because they give me the feedback, is a big part of what's there. So we spent a little bit longer than usual here, so we won't have to do that on the subsequent 3 episodes, because we're assuming you're going to come back for all of those too, and you heard all of this. Just one last thing to mention. We have incorporated a few sponsors. That's even technically, we're not always allowed to call them sponsors on the show.
Partners.
Partners. If you find any of those interesting, visit their sites. For example, the hosting site for us, Buzzsprout, is one of those others. You can support us by supporting them. We get a little bit from that, but in each instance there's an offer that you get something for as well. So it's that win-win thing that we've talked about before if you go there. Anything else, Lex, before we shut this one down?
I think that covers everything.
All right. We appreciate you joining us. Again, this is part 1 of 4. And if you want to come back and figure out where we are as we look where hurricanes happen and what they do and the historical what-ifs, we'll be covering that next week. So this is Don.
Alexis.
Signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time. Barring something, I guess, that we've adapted, we say from Yogi Berra. It's also adapted from a good friend of ours whose first name is Kenny. You know who you are.
And you need to be on the show, sir.
Yeah. If you happen across A Fork in Time, what should you do?
Take it.
All right. Thanks, guys. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.